Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, we have a special treat. In the first segment, we welcome back my founding co-host of the program, Dr. Peter Phillips. That is right. Peter Phillips and I started the Project Censored Show in 2010, and this is coming up on the 15th year anniversary of the program. And why am I inviting Peter back to the program? Well, Peter Phillips is Professor Emeritus of Political Sociology at Sonoma State University. He is, of course, the former director of Project Censored, former president of the Media Freedom Foundation. He was the editor and co-editor of 14 editions of the annual Project Censored book on the top 25 censored news stories. He's also author of Impeach the President, The Case Against Bush and Cheney from 2006, two editions of the Progressive Guide to Alternative Media and Activism, and also Giants, the Global Power Elite, which was his book on political sociology from 2018. Well, Peter Phillips has a long-awaited follow-up to Giants, and that is what we're talking about today. Peter Phillips' most recent book, just published this fall from the Censored Press and Seven Stories Press, is called Titans of Capital: How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity. And there it is right there. And there is my great colleague and friend, Peter Phillips. Peter, welcome to our program.
Well, Mickey, thank you. It's great to be back on. Yeah, you're in 50 stations across the country, and that's really amazing. I'm very proud to have been part of it when it started, and remember it all well.
Well, Peter, we've certainly grown the program and we've certainly grown the project from where you took it as the second director. And speaking of seconds, this is your second book about political economy. And what a timely release of Titans, this next installment, Titans of Capital: How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity. It's your follow-up to Giants, the Global Power Elite. Of course, listeners can hear in there sort of an invocation and a riffing on the great Seawright Mills and the power elite from the 1950s. Peter, remind our listeners, when you talked about giants in the power elite, talk to our listeners like, who did you mean were the giants? And then let's jump into, well, we have giants. Now, who are the titans of capital? Tell our listeners about what you mean by that kind of language in political economy.
The Giants were 5 years ago, $17 trillion capital investment companies. Now, a capital investment company is a company that manages wealth, money, for rich people. And I mean, there's no others. It's pretty straightforward. And the biggest one, of course, is BlackRock, which today has $10 trillion of money that they're managing. 5 years ago, they had 5 trillion. So they've doubled. All of them have doubled in the last 5 years. So when I wrote Giants, at that time, there were 17 companies that I called Giants that had $1 trillion or more. Collectively, they had 41 trillion dollars in investment capital. So I was looking at this is very concentrated. They've got only a couple hundred directors. They're all invested in each other, and this is pretty severe. So 5 years later, I wanted to update this. What's happened, especially through the pandemic? We're reading how the rich are getting richer, and that's just ongoing. And we're finding that there are now 31 companies or giants having over $1 trillion. Collectively, they control some $83 trillion worth of investment capital. So that was like too many to really do a good sociological analysis. I said, well, let's look at the top 10. And so BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, UBS of Switzerland, Fidelity, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase, Amundi in France, Allianz and PEMCO in Germany, and Capital Group. Those are the 10 big ones now. They have 117 directors. So I said, well, these 117 people are incredibly powerful because collectively they control $50 trillion worth of wealth today. So that's double concentration of what it was 5 years ago. So we need to give them a name that's significant. So we call them the Titans of Capital. And they really are. I mean, they're huge people in the sense of wealth control. And no human beings have ever controlled this much wealth in such a concentrated fashion in the history of capitalism. So as wealth has increased, there's now, the upper one half of 1% of the people in the world. That's the about 40,000 millionaires and almost 2 to 3,000 billionaires. A lot of these are multimillionaires. This is one half of 1% of the people. Their wealth has massively increased in the last 5 years, and when they have surplus of wealth, they give it to these companies to invest for them. So that's how BlackRock and Vanguard have all doubled in the past 5 years. And so it's an amazing system that's increasingly controlling vast amounts of wealth and investing it privately, of course. And it's wealth that they say, oh, it's going to trickle down, it's going to make the world better. No, it's not. It's having very serious consequences for the world. I mean, they're the number one investment group in tobacco worldwide. $100 billion in tobacco, which kills 8 million people a year. So that's a pretty negative consequence. They've got $60 billion invested in the big companies that produce alcohol. And that kills millions of people a year. I mean, an alcoholic on average, and this is what's amazing to me. We did the research. Half of the alcohol sold in the world is sold to alcoholics. They are people who are addicted to alcohol, and they on average drink 74 drinks a week. So they're the ones spending money, often all they have to maintain this habit, destroying families, destroying their own lives, making themselves ill. And the profits go to these giant investment management companies. The investment management companies are invested in war. They're invested in all the big military industrial complex companies. They're invested in all the companies in Israel that are making profits off the war against the Gazans and the genocide that's going on there. So this capital investment is not benefiting most of society, and in fact is hurting many millions of people in the world. So there's consequences for this, and it's undermining our environment. The Titans alone have $400 billion invested in the oil companies, which in the past 5 years has doubled. So they're all the big oil companies, Chevron, all of them have increased their oil sales. They are not reversing. They are not trying to lower global warming. They've increased, and part of that's funded by these capital concentrated companies.
So, Peter, in the last 5 years, six since your Giants book came out, can you talk a little bit about the trajectory of that wealth accumulation? I mean, when you wrote Giants, you were really exposing just this really unfathomable amount of money. Most everyday people can't even visualize what the money you're talking about even looks like. And of course, there's also been some critique, and you've mentioned as well as, I'm like, where does it even come from? Right? It's as if governments and places seem to manufacture it. Can you talk a little bit about this, the conundrum of currency, and can you talk a little bit about exactly what kind of concentration of wealth are we talking about here, number one? And then, of course, later we could easily talk about where else that money could maybe do different things. Peter Phillips.
Well, of course it could. And it's the one half of 1% of the people's money. It's the richest people in the world. When we say the top 10 companies control 50 trillion, that's 50,000 billions. I mean, that's what 50 trillion is. I mean, it's an unfathomable amount of money. And one of their biggest problems is they don't have good, safe places to invest it. They'll anything that's profitable, any company profitable in the world, they'll invest in. and they'll spread it around all over the world. Which is one reason that the U.S. has military bases all over the world, is to protect our investment capital, which is a vital interest identified by the government and the CIA and military. Our vital interest, primary vital interest, is capital. And so that money, protected by the U.S. government and Western governments, legally and militarily, is concentrated wealth of the 1/2 of 1% of the richest people in the world. And it's becoming more concentrated every day. So it's what we're saying is that this inevitability of concentration, it just can't go on indefinitely. They're not going to have any places to invest. They'll own everything. And essentially they're very close to doing that now. So this control of the world's wealth has all kinds of negative consequences. And it's not being reversed, it's being increasingly concentrated. So if they run out of good, safe places to invest, then they'll invest in speculative things like the subprime mortgage investment fiasco. And a lot of times they'll know that these are not safe investments if they do it anyway, because they have all this capital that they just want to get out there and get used and respond with. It's an extremely difficult and dangerous situation for everybody else in the world. And we think of we got an election coming up here, and we're going to vote for one side or the other, and it's not going to make any difference in terms of capital investment. Both the parties in the United States and all the Western governments, support concentrated capital and want to protect that's wealth. That's the number one vital interest under capitalism. So in that respect, we have a consequence that Robinson calls a crisis of the world. Literally, William I. Robinson, Santa Barbara, who he calls this, a world crisis, that environment, dangers of war, nuclear weapons, all of this threatens human existence. It threatens all human life, and
It's
that it's seemingly inevitable that some sort of collapse. This can't go on continuing to concentrate without increasing um, political control of the entire world.
I mean, $50 trillion, Peter Phillips was just looking a little bit, researching how much that was in a physical way, if you could sort of see what that looks like. And I found this it stacking 50 million stacks of 200,000 $5 bills on top each other. You could go from the Earth to the moon and then back to Earth again and then go back to the moon. Again, these are we can't even visualize
I
what
mean,
that means,
it's
what
just,
that is.
yeah, they're just digits in a computer somewhere, but we don't have that much cash,
No.
out there. The cash is simply representative and functional for what we use it for, but the wealth concentration, and then they're investing in it, so they're mandating that it continues to grow. See, capitalism that is not growing, it becomes what's called it becomes stagnant. And that means that there'll be actually an economic decline, a depression, economic recessions, people being laid off. It's the growth factor that is vital to the continuation of this. And it's inevitable that this growth can't continue, that we're going to see major economic collapse in some capacity worldwide if we continue on this track.
Well, and Peter Phillips, we've already seen, of course, this not only is the wealth concentration the epitome of a lack of equity in income distribution, literally, but it does impact different parts of the world in different ways. Like even though in the United States there's poverty, there's an unhousing crisis, there's a burgeoning prison population, there's a whole raft of issues, but um, overall, people in the United States tend to do better than many in the global South, for example, right? So there are certain parts of the
On
world.
average, on average, yes.
there have been places that have been routinely more exploited by these very sort of titans of capital. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So go
Well,
ahead,
we have to
talk a little
have
bit.
to look at that. You think about this though. At 1/2 of 1% that's controlling all this mass wealth, and 80% of the world, the people in the world, live on $10 a day or less. Half the people in the world live on $5 a day or less, um, which is pretty poor if you think about it, trying to get by on $5 a day. But several hundred million people um, live on what the UN calls extreme poverty, is $2.15 a day. And that's gone up. The number of people in extreme poverty has gone up in the past 5 years. Before that, the number of people in extreme poverty had declined somewhat. There was a trend towards people advancing beyond extreme poverty, so they were living on $4 a day or whatever. But still extremely poor. And the Titans were saying, "Oh, this is great now. It's trickling down, and we're going to have pretty soon we won't have extreme poverty," which is not true. It's gotten worse. The only place in the world where extreme poverty declined or was actually eliminated was China. Um, they had a deliberate policy of eliminating extreme poverty. They still have several hundred million people living on $5 a day, but which is pretty poor. But they deliberately got rid of extreme poverty, which was the main reason that extreme poverty had declined in the world um, up through 5 years ago.
And though there certainly are other issues and challenges in China.
Absolutely. But they they deliberately, because of their communist philosophy, have a belief in shared wealth, or at least all people having adequate income for a human existence.
And that's something that you've wrote about, the Zhao Kang concept. You wrote about that
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Titans.
We
In
did
other
a
words,
chapter on China.
even though there are challenges and certain issues, the bigger point I'm taking away is that there are things that collectively institutions could do that could be equitizing. There are things there are things that, they're like the World Economic Forum, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all the latter of those three kind of tools of Western capitalism to exploit the world in many ways. Would you suggest, Peter Phillips, that there are other ways that those bodies could be used or other policies that could change wealth distribution?
Well, the Titans themselves could say that this wealth concentration is inevitably destroying the world, which it is, and which my whole book points out and documents completely. And that they should do something about that, which is why I name the 117 people personally, uh, and say, okay, these are the people that are who they are, where they are, what kind of wealth they have, and how they got there. So number one Titan is Larry Fink at BlackRock. He controls more private capital than anyone else in the world, and he's got a board of directors of 14 people or so, and they're the ones who decide where it's going to get invested. So, but Larry Fink, I mean, he came up in a middle class family in L.A. So he gets an MBA out of UCLA, goes to work in New York for First Boston, becomes a star in terms of investment capital management, and then goes on to help get with Blackstone start his own company. And some 25 years ago, he does that, and now they're the number one investment capital company in the world. In that process, he became a billionaire officially last year. Forbes listed him for the first time. And so he has a lot of influence. He's on the executive committee of the World Economic Forum. He's on the Business Council, International Business Council. He's on the Business Roundtable. He's on the Council of Foreign Relations. And these are policy groups that elites serve on that make recommendations to the government, and the government sees them as orders, but makes recommendations to the government as to what their policies should be, and economic policies and military spending and all of that is part of that. So he's I call him number one Titan. And then there's 117 other people very much like him. Um, they're not all billionaires, and many of them are just the average one is probably worth 5 to 20 million, and is a heterosexual white man or woman, usually married with kids, who's had
Mostly
experiences.
men, right?
2/3 men,
Yeah.
and there's only 16 people of color in that group out of 107, and so it's predominantly white. And it's they're based in 2/3 are based in the U.S. and the other most there's 21 countries altogether, but they have one person from Lebanon and one person from Mexico, and
Mm-hmm.
in that group because they're on the board of directors of these top 10 companies. So that becomes this wealth concentration that is growing and is evidently concentrated and is having negative, detrimental consequences for everyone in the world. We are all poorer. We all have declined in wealth. And at the bottom 80%, the bottom half, the bottom 1/3 are literally in extreme poverty. That they're, I mean, extreme poverty is $2.15 a day. But if you're on less than $10 a day, which is 80% of the world is, imagine trying to have a lifestyle that we call middle class in this country, living on $10 a day. It doesn't happen. You're living in something you built or you inherited, or it's a hut or whatever, and you use that money primarily to eat, um, and buy necessities for yourself and your families. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling to think that there's such massive poverty in the world, and 20,000 people a day die because of inequality, either from malnutrition or easily curable diseases. So those numbers have been pretty consistent. It's 20 to 21,000 every year in and out are dying because of poverty. And that's a slaughter. And that doesn't have to happen.
Yeah, and it
I
doesn't
mean,
get framed that way, and it's very disconnected too. The media, the corporate media, rarely frame these things as having some causes because of wealth hoarding. And let's call it what it is, Peter Phillips. You're describing among the Titans wealth hoarding.
that's exactly what it is. And resource control. So we need a stronger democratic process of deciding how wealth of the world is used. We certainly need to have a minimum standard of living for everybody in the world. And the World Economic Forum talks about these things, and they say, "Oh, it's going to happen. Capitalism will grow us to a state where that'll be present." It's just not true. And they have this concept called EGS, environment, government, and social, or ESG, social and government. ESG has been used by investment capital companies to say, "Oh, this is our philosophy. We're believing in betterment for humankind," and they actually have funds that are supposedly ESG, but it's not changing anything. Well, global inequality has increased, and the dangers of wealth concentration have increased. The threat of war has increased. Military spending. I mean, we still are building, all these companies are invested in the nuclear weapons industry, making millions of dollars off of building new bombs.
Well,
And I mean, so it's just an ongoing, detrimental investments that hurt us all.
so
And
I'd
this
like
got to be reversed.
Peter Phillips is back with his follow-up Titans of Capital. how concentrated wealth threatens humanity, where he's looking at these wealthiest individuals. We mentioned Larry Fink and many others, of course, from BlackRock. But Peter Phillips, before the break, talking about wealth hoarding and particularly talking about money going into conflicts, warfare, how sort of this really unregulated, unbridled kind of global capitalism causes untold harm. You have a whole chapter that talks about tobacco, alcohol, plastics, firearms, gambling, and private prisons, where these titans are all very much invested in profiteering. And one of the, you mentioned a few of these already in our conversation, but I wanted to come back to another, and that's firearms. And it's not just the firearms that people use um, personally, and of course, which fuel mass violence in places like the United States, but it's the international military industrial complex. Um, Global war is ever profitable, and whether it's the U.S. sinking money into Ukraine after Russia's invasion there, or now whether it's the United States continuously pouring money and weapons into Israel and their relentless onslaught on Gaza, the Palestinians, that's spread to Lebanon, that's going to Iran. We could be teetering on the brink of a major world war here, Peter Phillips. And after looking at your book and your arguments, it's hard to separate what you're talking about from this serious calamity that we face of global violence. And let's not forget what could lead to, with the provocations between the West and Russia and China, could lead to nuclear annihilation. So, Peter Phillips, maybe address some of the ways in which this hoarding of wealth and this profiteering from warfare is literally bringing us to the brink of destruction.
That was a nice summary of my book. Thank you. That was a good, yeah, I mean, that's the danger. We are facing human extinction if we continue on this path of wealth concentration, expanded military and weaponry, threats to countries that have a communal philosophy or a communist philosophy. And that, the Atlantic Council, which is the advisory board for NATO, has called for regime change, not only in Russia with Putin, but regime change in China as well. And of course, these governments know that. Now, China has been very successful in creating capital concentration or capital growth, and they have almost as many billionaires as the United States does. The difference is the billionaires here can invest in the government, they buy the government, they support it, they'll pick a party or both, they give to both parties, and they have an immense say in what the policies will be coming out of our government and our policy groups. The Chinese billionaires have zero say in what the Communist Party is going to do. They're allowed to have wealth, and but they have to be subject to the political control of the Chinese Communist Party, which is overall seeking betterment for all human beings worldwide. That's their core belief. So if we believe in humanitarian democracy, um, try to have human betterment in the world, the core issue that we have to face is wealth concentration. And which is why I name the individuals who control this 50 trillion. These people have, names and addresses. They can all be reached through their companies. There's bios on each one. They're all most of them have a graduate degree, and are on other companies' boards. In
Yeah.
fact, I evaluated the board of directors they're on 133 other companies, the Titans. And those 133 other companies have a gross income equivalent to larger than every country in the world, the GDP of every country in the world except uh, China, and the US and Japan.
That's riveting. I mean, that's
I
again,
mean, it
that's
is.
extraordinary.
And those 10 companies are all invested in each other. There's over $300
Yes.
million cross invested. So they all have a common interest. They all watch each other very closely. And they control how wealth is spent and invested in the world today.
So
That we got to change.
Peter Phillips, we have a few minutes left in this segment. I'm talking to you Monday, October 28th. By the time this airs, the United States will have had another presidential election. But based on the research you have here, it doesn't seem that the Titans are deterred based on the outcome of the election.
No, they're going to win either way. Um, they will continue in power. Wealth will continue to be concentrated unless there is a whole lot of millions of people that say enough of this, and that we have to do that, and or they get a conscience. And I have some hope in that area, because if there's civil unrest pending worldwide, then the elites know that they're a small minority in this sea of humanity,
Well,
that they're threatened, and so um, we can see sometimes they will make corrections. The all the governments, the United States government in particular, totally opposed labor unions in the 30s when the people were marching and the general strikes that happened then and all of that. They totally opposed it. But there were, liberal elites inside of the government, inside of corporate America, that said, well, maybe we have to make some adjustments or this is going to get out of hand. And they did. We got in 35, we got the National Labor Relations Act, Social Security Act,
mhm.
two biggest forms of legislation. The elites never wanted to go give up on those, and they're still trying to undermine them. But there were concessions made, and I'm optimistic that if there's enough threatened unrest in the world today, or in the U.S. today in particular, that concessions can be made, and that the elites may decide, okay, let's give 2% of all of each transaction to world poverty.
Well, Peter Phillips, there's two areas today where we face major crises as far as humanity, where Titans are well, certainly to blame in part or large part, but they also could maybe attenuate them, and that is, of course, the climate crisis and issues of war and peace.
Yes, yes.
So, your
And
thoughts on those?
well, the climate crisis is not being reversed. Capital is increasingly invested in oil and gas. They're trying to build these machines that will suck carbon dioxide out of the air.
Are they called
Al
trees?
Gore calls it, he says it's ridiculous. But they're spending $1 billion on building these big air sucking machines. Uh, so they're hoping for a technological fix, and it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
And as far as mobilization goes, we've certainly seen young people around the US and people all over the world protesting the carnage in the Middle East, that Israel is letting loose against the Palestinians, now attacking
Environmental
Lebanon.
destruction, global damage, 350.org. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people that realize that we have a super crisis facing the world today. And that crisis is perpetuated by continued wealth concentration, where these resources, this money, this ability to do things, isn't being properly used.
So,
So
Peter Phillips, in the introduction to concluding remarks, um, in the forward to your book, Dan Kovalik, the political critic, uh, writes about he actually quotes Michael Parenti saying, when Parenti was once asked what the capitalists want, his answer quite simply was everything. They want all the wealth, the world's wealth and riches for themselves, and every choice they make kind of comes back to that. And Peter Phillips, you have a letter that you had at the end of Giants that you have included again in Titans. That literally is a letter written as a personal appeal to each of these folks, each of these people as human beings. And so, ending on this note, how is it that you think that we, the people, can have humanitarian movements to possibly attenuate our directions and move toward a more just, sustainable, and equitable world?
social movements are emerging all the time. The Occupy movement scared them, and they use government to repress it, infiltrate it, discredit it, media discredit it. They were quite severe. but um, movements of people, young people in particular, can have major consequences on terms of how elites perceive what they're doing and maybe make adjustments. That has to happen. And I think it's inevitable that it will in various capacities. The degree to which elites will use the power of government, the power of the police force, power of the military to repress sometimes depends on the leadership. Um, and that, of course, is a big concern for our current election. And but nonetheless, both parties totally support the continuation of capital, protection of capital, and the continued concentration of global wealth. That we have to adjust. That we have to address openly. And by looking at this book, I mean, I help identify who these people are, where the wealth is, what could be done with it, and I call them out in a letter with signed by 90 friends and associates, that including you, uh, that are saying, "Hey, it's time to stop this. We've got to reverse what you're doing." And if you can't do it without, you can't do it by yourself, then we're going to have to help you along.
Well, the book is Titans of Capital: How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity. Distinguished professor at UC Santa Barbara, William Robinson, says it is an impeccably researched and shocking expose. Political theorist Aaron Good says if you want to know about who is running the world on behalf of the global oligarchy of wealth, read Titans of Capital. Peter Phillips, as always, it is a delight to have you on the show that you helped to get rolling out into the world, co-founder of the Project Censored Show, previous director of Project Censored, and you are the author of many books, including Giants, the Global Power Elite, as well as your newest book, Titans of Capital: How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity. You can learn more at projectcensored.org or censoredpress.org. Peter Phillips, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me back on. It's been great fun.